All right, well, here we go again. So it's 9:18, a little bit earlier than I usually do it. So the babies are still up, but going to bed soon. So if I have to leave prematurely, that's probably the reason. All right, so we're going to pick up where we left off. It's been a couple days. And as we talked about last time, I'm going to go right to the GitHub issues for this project. Hopefully they're going to steer us right in the right direction. If you haven't watched before, this is episode 8, live coding charity auction management web application using TDD and JSON API sort of compliant server, and we'll end up building an Ember client later. 100% of the work that I've done has been streamed and available on YouTube, so you can go back and check out how we created the initial requirements and how we've gone through the whole process. And I guess we'll just keep going. All right, so let's switch over. All right. So here are the issues that we left off with. I marked the ones with this green ready label if we're ready to work on them. The two that I think we want to look at right now are the non-DevOps one. So one is create the API documentation. Now we haven't written any, there's no API right now, public API, as in HTTP API available yet. So we've got this one that relates to that, and we've got this create resources for all models using JSON API-resources. And we just made a few notes about the various resources that we wanted to include. It looks like there are 8 models we wanted to have resources for, and since this is going to be API first, everything is going to have, or at least all of these models, which are the core ones we've written so far, they're going to have endpoints, and just a couple of miscellaneous points there. Then here, create API documentation with RSpec API documentation. So we're going to combine these two together. So basically, I'm going to install RSpec API documentation, give you a quick tour through that, and then we'll go documentation in, or I mean API in. So we'll write the specs that will ultimately generate the documentation for the endpoints, and we'll kind of go backwards towards the resources using that sort of TDD approach. All right, so let's get going on this one. Okay, so let's take a look at this library out on GitHub. So it says automatically generate API documentation from RSpecs. I think this is a great library. I think it's very well done. I think it fits very well with how I tend to write code. So let's take a look at a sample, see what they've put out here. Yeah, so this isn't that pretty of an example. We're going to use the epitome or API to me, however you say it, add-on that makes it look a little bit better. But this is the idea. You have like complete documentation for an endpoint, including what the parameters are, what the request should look like, what the response should look like, examples of everything. It's really quite robust. And it's the output of tests. So, we're going to basically write what would be similar to either controller or request specs that are going to spit out the documentation, because we're going to use kind of the additional syntax that this library gives us. So let's do it. Okay, so first thing first, we'll just read the documentation here. We'll add this to our gem file. Just make sure I left this in okay shape here before we get going. All right. All right, so we're going to install this. Then let's see what they say. So this is the basic flow, right? So we're going to add acceptance test. That's the type that it expects. Then we'll create an acceptance test for a resource. Now we don't have any resources yet, but this is fine. We'll sort of go backwards, and it'll be good. So we'll generate this acceptance test. The acceptance test is going to look something like this. Then you generate the docs, and then you can open them up. we're going to use this API to me, or epitome, Rails engine. I think that that's my preference. And then we've got some config to do. So why don't we do the config first, just to get it out of the way. We'll go from there. So we're going to use this guy, epitome, and it just makes for a prettier looking output. I've used the rad docs before too. I think this one's a bit better, so we're gonna go with this one. You can check out the rad docs example if you want to see an alternative. Okay. So what's it say? Run the generator, get an initializer and the initial README doc. Yeah, that's fine. We'll do that. All right, so what does this add? So adds the JavaScript and CSS that make it look and behave a bit prettier. This API.markdown file, that kind of, we'll see what that is, but that is like the README at the top of your API docs. And then this is the initializer. We'll just take a look at that. So this is an engine, so it gets mounted somewhere in your application. We're going to mount at v1. One of the things you saw, I think, or you may have seen in my issues before in GitHub, is that I wanted to namespace it v1. So we're going to do that. Just keep looking down. So the doc path, then that's fine. So we'll keep to there. Charity auction server API documentation. Okay. We'll stick with that. And this, let's see. So this is in root. So this is doc/API README. So it's going to be right there. I think that's fine. If we had changed the doc path, we would want to change this, but we'll keep it this way. And then this is going to be a relatively small application, so we'll config to have it be a single page. Otherwise, it can take a little bit too long to boot, but this will be fine for us. So that looks fine. Let's go back to our spec API documentation. Okay, so here we are. So let's create our first test. Now, keep in mind, again, we don't have any resources, so we're going to go backwards, but that's okay. It'll be a little awkward for the first resource, and then after that, I think you'll find that it's a very good workflow. So where shall we start? I think I'm going to start with user. That tends to be the first thing that gets created in an application. Now, we don't have the authorization set up yet, but it's fine. It doesn't really matter what we start with. I think user is a perfectly normal place to start. So we're going to do that. So over in our project in the spec directory, I'm going to make a directory for acceptance test. Right? That's the convention for our spec API documentation. You saw that here. So we're going to keep with it. Okay. So we're going to, inside of here, make a user spec. Now, you see that there's this, require our spec API documentation DSL. That's the DSL that the library gives us that ends up being kind of what creates the documentation along with the test. We may end up, we don't have to require the spec helper because that's going to be required by default by our .rspec file. Now, we may end up creating a different helper here that sets up some other documentation centric code, but for now, I'm going to keep it this way, just according to what the example says. Okay, so just paste their example just to get something going, and we're gonna post to /v1/users, right? That's where we'd like for the user's endpoint to be. That's sort of the JSON API. What's going to be JSON API compliant, and we want it to be namespaced. All right, so we're going to say create user. And now let's go over and check out some of the documentation. So now here's the config. And you know what, we're going to do this first. I sort of skipped over this accidentally. I was thinking we did it when we did the API to me deal, but we didn't. So I'm going to do that now. So we're going to add an initializer for this. Okay. Now, so I paused here because it feels a little weird to have this run in all environments, this initializer, when it's really a test-specific thing. So, you know, I'm going to actually, we're going to change what I just said a minute ago and move this. I don't want to do it there. And I'm going to do the same for the API to me. So we're going to, in our spec directory, we're going to create a RSpec API documentation helper. Okay, and then in here, we'll configure this. We'll also configure API to me, I think, in a second. And then in our user spec, we will require that. Let's see. I think that that's all I have to do. I just had a brain cramp on this, but let's see. Yeah, okay, so yeah, okay. I don't know why I had a temporary blank on if that require was correct, but it is. So now we don't have that running in the environments we didn't expect, which I think is a lot more normal to do. So I'm going to move the API to me into that also, and then any other sort of configure, any other setup we do will be in here, which I think makes significantly more sense to me. What we're going to do too is go back to the gem file, and we'll move these two into, let's see here, I'm thinking. We certainly can move this one into the test environment. I'm blanking for a second here if we need. I don't think, you know, we may need that in other environments to actually serve the documentation, but well, we'll find that out. For now, I'm going to have these just be in actually the test environment because I think that's where it makes sense. If we need to move them, that'll be, you know, obviously pretty straightforward to do. So back to this. Now we're going to configure RSpec API documentation, and we'll keep going. Okay, so we've got the output folder at doc API. So I think that we are going to want to namespace this. So I'm going to put v1, because if we had other documentation at some point, we'd want to be able to sort of, you know, co-locate it. This will, you know, co-locate it in the doc folder. So this will plan for that. For the output format, we're going to have JSON because we're using API to me. So I'm going to change that. Location of templates. I don't think we don't need this one, so I'm gonna get rid of that. Keep these. I don't think we're gonna. I'm going to leave this in here, and we'll see if we end up keeping it there. I think we may not. All right, so this is which of the headers do we want to include in the request and the response. Now the answer is not going to be all, so we're going to end up setting this, but let's see what it spits out by default, and then we can make some adjustments. I think that'll be interesting to see what the deal is with that. And then, yeah, this is more curl request stuff. So we won't have to deal with that now either. Keep source order. Yeah, I think we want to do that. So I'm going to say true to that. I think it's nice to be able to just to explicitly put them in the order that we expect them in. We'll name this something reasonable. Fine, 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 fine. What's this say? So you can define documentation groups as well. A group allows you to generate multiple sets of documentation. By default, the group's doctor is a subfolder under the parent group based on the group's name. I'm going to namespace this. I don't know if we're going to end up using this, but okay. Post body formatter, we actually, I think, are going to end up adjusting this, but we will see the error in not doing so in a second. We don't need that. We are not going to disable status. We're not going to disable this. So, you know, I doubt that we got this exactly right, but we will see in a minute. I've got examples of multiple examples of configured apps to refer to if I, you know, if something is taking too long to fidget with. So, okay, so we've got that. So now let's go back to our documentation and just get a sense as to what things look like. All right, so basically you say the resource, which is just the string of the class name usually. Then this is the path that'll actually get called. And then usually you use this example request, which is going to make this call to the server using the parameters that you set, at least on the post side of yeah, so we'll get to that. Let's just, I'll make an example and it'll be straightforward. All right, so we want to have example request create user. Now we don't need do request if you use example request. If you just say example, then you have to actually explicitly say do request. Okay, and then we're going to define what parameters we use. So if we go back to the user model, right, we've got name. Actually, I go to the spec. So we got name, mobile, phone number, email address, and physical address as our 4 required attributes. So we're going to have those, and I think those are the only attributes. So we're going to have these all then be set in our example of using the API. So I'm just going to make a note of these. Okay, so I'm actually going to use a string, and the reason will be pretty straightforward or pretty obvious in a second. Okay. So the options are, we'll say scope attributes, which is going to be where do we put this parameter in the request's body. And this is going to be required true, which will format what it will what it'll look like in the table of parameters. So then here we'll just describe it as, you know, the name of the user. Nothing much to that. And then here we'll have let name, and then this will be the value that actually gets sent. So I'll put mine. Okay, so we're going to repeat this for each of the attributes. Now, in our server, because it's common on the Ember side to have dasherized attribute names, we're going to that's what they're going to be in our server. And this can feel a little weird to Rails programmers sometimes, but I think that it's more friendly to the client, and that's what the API is about. So that's what we're going to do. Mistake here. Now, remember what the point is of all this, which is we're going to both test that we've got endpoints that behave the way that we want, and we're going to get documentation for free as a result. That's why we're doing this. Now, I don't really have interesting validation set on the mobile phone number. If I did, I would describe it a little bit here. But for now, it's just required, and we really permit anything. So, I won't say anything more than that. Oops. Okay. All right, we'll do the two others. And I know it'll all come together in a second after we fidget with the setup of our spec API documentation, which I'm sure I got a little bit wrong. But my philosophy on recording this series has been to sort of go through the process of setting up from absolute scratch without even referring to all the projects that I've done that use this before. It's been a while since I set it up without referring to those, and that's good. I mean, it'll make you more confident about how to do it yourself. All right, so we've got the parameter for email address. Pretty straightforward, of course. All right, just about done with this. All right. All right, so we've got that. So now when this request is made, it's going to make the request with these parameters added on, right? This is when we require the RSpec API documentation DSL. That's what's going to give us the methods like resource and post and parameter, or maybe not post, but parameter example request. That's what they all come from. Okay, so now this isn't going to work. I mean, we don't expect it to work, but what we'll do is I'll run it, and then we'll just follow the trail of the errors until we get things working finally. Okay, so undefined method resource for main object. Now, I just said what the problem is here. So if you're listening to when I said that resource came from the DSL from our spec API documentation, remember, we don't have that required anywhere. So we've got to go back to our helper, and the first thing that I'll do is require that. So we'll see if we get a different error now. We didn't. I'm just going to paste this in here to see. Okay, so if I ever have something like this happen twice, where I don't think there should be an error, I stop Spring and try again. That is not, well, let's figure this out. So requiring this should get that done. That's why I am kind of stumped. Yeah, okay, so it's not Spring because I just ran bundle exec and I didn't see it. Still seeing undefined method resource. Interesting. So I said rspec.resource. Let's just take a look at the let's take a look at our configuration and see if anything looks a little funny about it. I mean, it could, maybe that's it. So in our RSpec, we're not allowing monkey patching. I wonder if that's what does it. I may look up another project that I've got quick to see if that's what it is. I suspect that's what it is. It looks to be. All right. Okay, so let's just sort of work through the rest of it. So this is undefined method client for our spec example group. So I'm going to, here while we're doing this, I'm going to open up this project because I've already got this one configured just to, I don't want to waste too much time on this to see if there are things that jump out at me. That's curious to me that I required this here. It doesn't seem like I would need to do that. I'm going to check the gem file and see if I had said require false, and I didn't. Well, I don't think that's it, but I'm going to put that back here and check a little bit later if that seems to be a problem. Let's take a look at the other differences. I'm actually going to copy this method while we're looking at it, and I'll describe what it does because we're about to make that change in a second. So this is down in the post body formatter. Since we're using our spec API document, or what am I talking about? Since we're using JSON API, everything in the params is going to be nested under the data key in our in the JSON. So that means that all the params from what we set up are going to be inside of data. So the post body, we're going to format that way, right? We're going to put the params hash as the value for the data key, and then call to JSON on it, right? Because that's consistent with JSON API. So we'll do that. I'm going to remove some of the cruft since I'm looking at this other guy too. The client method, I think, was the source of that other problem. We're gonna just crib these request headers to include and exclude. Authorization, I'm going to take this out right now because we're not going to be dealing with that just yet. When we get to authentication and authorization, then I'll add that back in. But I want to make sure it's clear at the time while we're doing that. Okay. See where we are. Okay, so now this is the error that I thought we'd get at the beginning. So that only took a few minutes of detour. All right. So our error that we saw was that there's no controller at v1 users. So now we're actually to the point where we're going to deal with JSON API-resources, which is what's going to give us that controller. So let's go check out that project and get that set up. This is JSON API-resources. This is a project that I've been quite involved in. It's I'd say popular right now and under pretty active development, but used in production. I use it in production. Other people do too. So anyway, so let's go through this. So the documentation is pretty good. It would take a while to go through. We're not going to use a lot of the features right away, so I'm not going to spend too much time sort of giving a preview. But the point of JSON API resources is to do two things. So one is it's to create the endpoints, the controllers, and the actions on the controllers that are compliant with the JSON API. You can go to jsonapi.org to learn more about the spec. And then the second thing is it's a serializer that can serialize your model instances into the JSON API-compliant format. But so it's sort of equally handles the verb and the noun side of JSON API. So we're going to add this to our gem file. We'll just use the current version for now. I think we don't need anything that's on master, so we'll stick with that. Let's take a look at what version it's going to give us. 0.1.1. That sounds a little off. Let's take a look at what version is on. Right, 0.6.0. So I typically run it on master to make sure that it's not breaking anything on my production apps, which is why I didn't have the one that I expected there. Okay, so now we're using the one that I expected. Okay, so let's go back to our documentation, see what it says to do. Okay, so it doesn't specifically say this, but we're going to configure it. So in this one, we are going to add an initializer, and then I'll walk through the config file, and we'll change any of the defaults if we want to right now. I don't think we'll have to really change any to begin with. Okay, let's take a look through. So I mentioned before we're going to use the dasherized key. I think that's both the default, and I think it's the friendly to the client approach. Route format will also use dasherized. We're using active record. We are using integer resource keys. I have not switched to UUID yet. I think that I likely will at some point soon. I think it's a better approach, but I've been using the default Rails integer, so and we are with this project, so I'm going to stick to that. We're going to allow, include, sort, and filter. Those are great features, so we're going to keep that there. We are going to raise if parameters are not allowed. You know, sometimes I don't do this one, but for now we will, and if we find it annoying later, we can always change that. Default paginator, we are going to use offset. Top level links include pagination. We'll say true on this one since we're going to go with the paginator. Default page size we'll do a bit bigger. These are going to be pretty simple resources. We'll say, 50, maximum page size 200, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Record count we'll put at the top level. So we're never going to have a huge table, so that's fine. And plus it's a feature to sort of show. Use text errors. Well, I don't remember what that means. I'm going to use the default then. We can look at it later if we want. We're not going to whitelist any exceptions for now, although, and I don't think we will later either. Well, we may once we add pundit, looking back at the documentation that I actually wrote here. And then resource linkage. So what does this say? Always include. So I'm going to say yes. I think it's more consistent on the client side. Okay, so we've got that configured. And again, we could have skipped that a little bit, but might as well walk through what they are. So what I'm going to do is to kind of try to get our sort of TDD deal going. We're going to use the method that JSON API-resources gives us here to add the routes to our application route. So it's JSON API_resources and then the name of the resource. And that's to match the Rails kind of convention of resources and then the symbol for the resource. Okay, so JSON API-resources. Now, I'm actually going to namespace that. I think that's the syntax. Okay, now we saw there's a different error there. So now it says I couldn't find the resource v1 users. Okay, so that's good. That's the error that we wanted, right? Because we haven't actually created the resource yet. So good. We're gonna do that now. And hopefully this flow is making sense, right? That I'm sort of starting with the test and I just fix every message and then I get a new one and it kind of tells me what to do next. So I'm going to make a folder v1, again, in case we had v2 or whatever later. We'll just namespace from the beginning. And then I'm going to make a user resource. No, is this capitalized? So the resource is the class that'll define how the resource should behave in the API. It can feel a little redundant with the model, but and to some extent it is, but it also, it includes additional things and can also, it sort of creates a buffer between what is your sort of logical model inside and what you want exposed to the outside world. So we'll call this user resource, and it's going to inherit from, now I'm going to have it inherit from base resource, which isn't a class that we have yet, but I'm going to make it. Whoops. Okay, and then this is going to inherit from JSON API resource. I'm just going to check that that's the okay, that's right. Oh, and you can see there that there's a generator. Now, for whatever bad reason, I don't tend to use the generator, but I probably should. It would make for a better video, I think. Okay, so the base resource is just going to allow us to create some abilities that all of the resources will have. I always do this because you'll see later that we're going to add things to this that help with authorization. And maybe authenticate. No, I think authentication is going to go in the controller, but yeah. So we're gonna do that, and we have to, in the base resource, declare abstract. In other words, it's not actually, there's not a controller that's going to go with this, and then everything else we'll have is going to inherit from that. And again, we don't have anything in here yet, but we will in a little bit. So I'm going to make it this way. Okay, now I will so it says that it doesn't have the resource, or it's not loading the file. So I think that we have to, because we've got it nested, I think we're going to have to require this file, or this directory rather. Yeah, right. I know it's cheating to look, but sometimes I forget what the syntax is. So, right, we're going to shovel onto auto load paths the app resources. Oh, that's just for concerns. So maybe I didn't need to do that. Maybe that wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem was that and I'm going to find out. Maybe I needed to stop. Yep, that's what it was. The infamous spring stop, which I forget to do. Okay, so let's go through what the resource file for user does, kind of the simplest version, and then we'll write a very simple spec to make sure that ours is doing that, and then we'll get back to the acceptance test that we were writing in the first place. Okay, so the first thing that the resource does is it declares its attributes, like what are that, and these can be their attributes on the underlying model, so our user model in the example that we're on right now, or they can be virtual attributes that we, methods that we define on the resource itself. Okay. The next thing we do is we say which of the fields are fetchable. Now, it's going to default to be all of the fields, I think, and we're going to see that in a second. But if we wanted to modify which fields we would allow someone to fetch based on the context, we can do that. And the same goes for creatable and updatable attributes. So I think that we're going to implement all of this. I think it's the sort of thing you're going to want to do, so why not cover it? So let's just test that it has the creatable, updatable, and fetchable fields, because that's really the public API, I think, for attributes that we care about here. So for user, we had 4 creatable attributes, and all 4 we're going to have be updatable too. So I'm just going to list these out. Here are these guys. Okay. Let's see. So it has the expected creatable attributes. Now, the creatable attributes method has context as a required argument. So we are going to just pass an empty context for now. That's totally fine. And we'll expect that to equal creatable attributes. Okay, so undefined method for the class. So let's go implement it. So I always define my class methods by sort of reopen the class using this syntax and then define it this way because it makes it searchable, right? If you don't do it this way, then if I want to search, the project for like def creatable, and I didn't remember it was a class method, then it's not going to find it, and that drives me nuts. So I always do it this way. Okay. So, and that made sense. There's no superclass method for this because we didn't see it, or because if there was, then we wouldn't have gotten that error before. Now, why isn't there though? That is a fair question. I guess that the yeah, well, we need back to that. Maybe it's just not defined in JSON API resource, that class. So you just have to implement it every time. I'm not positive. I mean, that's what it appears to be, but we'll see. Okay. And I'm going to switch to have these be integers. I think that's more sort of idiomatic. Okay. All right, and then we'll expect that it has the same updatable too. We're not going to use any logic to change these based on the context. We really won't in general. So, you know, this is another case where, you know, the spec isn't massively useful, but I think it makes clear what the intent is, and I tend to not like to have to think through whether or not to make tests, so I just do it. All right, and then the next is it has the expected fetchable attributes. Now, what that's going to be is a little bit different. So that's going to be the creatable plus ID updated at and created at as well. So we're going to need a subject here. And we're going to end up implementing something in the superclass to make all of this a little bit easier when we get to our second resource, but I'm going to sort of have that process just unfold naturally. So to create a new instance of the user resource, we just have to pass instance of the underlying model and then the context as well. In the context, I can just make blank here. That's fine. Oh, and here I just noticed that error. Jeez. Okay, so subject fetchable fields, and we expect that to equal the creatable attributes plus ID created at and updated at. And I'm going to have, I'm going to sort each of these just because the order is not important. I'll do that up here too. Okay. So now we get the error that I should have spotted earlier. So we'll just alias that. Now we just have this. Okay. So we expected all of these. We only got the ID, which is the default here. So I can call super plus, I'm going to call self.class.creatable. Oh, geez, it's fields, not attributes. That's why I didn't see. That's why the superclass error thing struck me before as strange. Well, we would have seen this error in a couple seconds when we got back to the acceptance test, but that's really dumb. if I had just read the documentation back here, I think I would have seen that nice and clearly. Yeah, geez, that's dumb. All right, so those all are fine now. Now again, we're not going to want to repeat this again and again, so we're going to end up moving something to base resource. And we can do that now, actually. So we've got the test that's going to test this right. So what we should do is move to base resource and define fetchable fields to be this. And then back here, we should just be able to do that. That should pass fine, so good. All right, so we've got our basic resource. Now this resource doesn't do much, right? It's got a simple set of creatable fields. The updatable fields are the same. They don't take a look at the context. Ditto for fetchable fields. We don't have filters. We don't have, we don't have lots of things. But that's fine, right? I mean, we should be able to use a default on most things, so we'll be able to use it here. All right, so back to that acceptance test. There we go. So we got a new error, uninitialized constant v1 users controller. So JSON API resources sets up, that kind of does everything for us to create controller, but we actually have to create the file for the controller. So we'll do that. Now, this is going to inherit, we're going to handle this one the same as the JSON API resource, which is we're going to make application controller actually inherit from JSON API resources controller. And let's go back to the documentation to take a look at this, because almost all of our controllers are going to inherit from that. And we want that to be, I sort of want that to be the base application controller. And then if we have, and we'll have some other controllers, we'll just inherit from action controller base or whatever the base class is in Rails. Okay. So we're going to inherit from this guy. So we're doing that. So there we go. Now we're going to add some other things to application controller as we go, but not in this episode. Okay, so I've got my controller. Ooh, we are getting somewhere. So this says expected 201, got 415. So let's take a look at JSON API resources to see what the error code 415 is all about. This may or may not be in, oh, it is. Okay, so unsupported media type is the error code. So the JSON API spec, if we go to it, just take a quick look, and you should look at this if you haven't before. So let's go to the specification and take a look at what it says about this. Okay, so the client must send application vnd.api plus JSON as its content type. So that's we're not doing that right now, which is the reason that it's throwing that error. Okay, So I'm going to remind myself here how to set that. Okay, so it's this. So there's a header method, which we're going to use. Okay. We're going to have to do that every time. So now we went from 415 to 400. 400 is, that's just the standard old oh, that's the status, right? So when I see a 400 now, what I'm going to do is print out what's the error message from the server, because it's going to be descriptive now that it's kind of getting past the initial errors. So when you use JSON API, or not that, when you use RSpec API documentation, it has this response body method instead of response dot body that you'd be used to. Just a heads up on that. So missing parameter type, right? So if we go to the JSON API spec, which is here, you need, let's take a look at what yeah, here we go. So this is what the request needs to look like. So we've put the params under the data key, so we've done that right. And then we nested the attributes under attributes, but we didn't add the type, which we need to do. That's not optional. So we're going to add that back to the top here. That's require true. Now, you may wonder, why the heck do I have to do that? Because isn't it included in the URL? Well, one of the sort of late additions to JSON API that I think was great was the addition of type everywhere. And it's really the combination of type and ID that's the identifier for the resource. And that's so that we can handle polymorphic types, which is a very important thing, I think, for the spec to be able to handle, and it does. So in this case, it's always users. Okay. All right, so no implicit conversion of nil to hash. Well, I did not expect that. What is that about? So I do not know what, I may have to run this was the -b. That looks like an error that's happening inside of JSON API resources. So I think -b is the backtrace. Okay, so line 614 of the JSON API resource, that class, and merge is where we're seeing this. Now, this will be a good opportunity to sort of show how to spelunk into the particular gem that you're using. It'd be fun to see what stupid mistake I made, but let's do that. So I'm going to say bundle open JSON API resources. All right. Okay. So what was that error we saw again? No implicit conversion of nil into hash. Oh, right. Okay. So this is what, so I saw this attributes and it reminded me that back in our user resource, we did not actually declare the attributes. Now, probably should be a better error message than that. I'll make a note of that and get it added to the project, but that was the mistake. But anyways, that's how I generally would go and take a look into a gem or library if I saw an error like that was coming from outside of my application. All right, cool. So now we've got a new error. So we thought we'd get 201, we got 422, which is the different than the 400 and the 415, etc. we saw before. So that's good. Let's take a look at the response body and see what it tells us. Whoops. Oh, right. Okay. So we've got a blank password, which is expected because if we go back to our user spec, right, it validates. Well, actually, we don't have a test. That's interesting. That's why I didn't notice that. So we sort of implicitly have a test that it validates that password is valid here, but it was not in my list here, so I didn't notice it. So that's an interesting little side note. Oh, heck. Now, so it said that it doesn't have the attribute password because it doesn't, right? This is just comes in. We can't read it back. But it does validate the presence of password, I think. It does. So now I'm going to add that in just because it makes it more explicit the next time if someone looks at it, they can tell what the validations are. It's not sort of buried here, given that I like to use the spec as sort of the documentation. Okay, so we'll go back here. This is going to have attribute password. Also, and in our create, well, should have. Now, so we expect the creatable fields to have password. I'm going to say that the updatable fields can also have password, but the fetchable fields will not. So I'm going to change that. So I'll run this spec now. We'll see that they're all wrong, right? It thinks the password should be in the one and not in the other, and it's all backwards. So I'll add this to that, and then where are we? Oh, interesting, right. So I should have even caught this before too. So now it's showing sort of duplicates of them because the super already has those in it, which I know. I think that means that I can just comment those out and it's going to be just fine. Is that true? Oh no, because then it thinks ID too. Okay. So what we're going to do then is we're going to go back to base resource, and I'm going to implement a base version of these two because I never want ID to be in there. Right, and there, I mean, sometimes you want to be able to create the ID. So, I mean, it's not dumb that it's smart that it's set the way that it is. It's just in our case, that's not what we want. All right, so I'm going to say super minus ID, and then I'm going to oops. Okay, so now when I go back to this guy, this creatable fields can just be super plus password. No, password's even going to be in there. So I think I can actually get rid of these and it'll be fine. Is that true? Yep, except I don't need this anymore. And this is going to be minus. There we go. Okay, well that's much neater. That's fine. Our base resource looks good too. Okay, good. So let's go back to our acceptance test. We still have an error. Oh, right, because we haven't set password, right? So it will say the password for the user. I don't think we have any interesting validations on that now either, so we won't mention those. Oh, I didn't set one. I'll just do that. Bam, look at this. So now we've got it working. I was printing out the response. You can see the response is a JSON API-compliant response. And I'm going to get rid of this. Now, I don't like the format that I use there, so I'm going to say post v1 users. I think that'll look nicer in the documentation. And if I wanted to test, besides that it was created successfully, I could test other things like, let's say, you know, user equals json.parse response body, right? I could say expect user data attributes email address to equal send email address. There we go. Now I test that too. So, you know, when whatever sort of feels like you need to test, which I think could certainly be whether or not they got set or not, whatever you felt comfortable with, then you do. So now the idea is now, hey, we did this just to test that we actually had an API that was working as expected, but all of this sort of setup, all of the setup is going to actually create the documentation too. So I'm going to go back here and run bundle exec rake docs generate. That's how you. Okay. So the reason that I just saw that is that I need this to be in my test documentation too, or to my test group too. I'm going to move this just in case. Okay. Okay, so you can see it's pretty straightforward to see what just happened. It's going to run those, and now if we haven't performed it yet. So Rails S. So now I should actually, let me run bin rake routes and see if there's a route for this or not. Yeah, so API to me at API docs. Now, I don't think that's where we want to mount it, so we're going to change that in a second, but okay. So it says I couldn't find it at doc/API/index.json. So let's take a look at where it actually was put. And it's in v1 API index.json. That means we just didn't configure something right, which I was sure was going to happen. Oh, that's interesting. So, I think this is because we needed to actually have this API to me not in back in that initializer that it installed it into. Big shock. I was a little bit overzealous in moving it here. I think that actually will change where it mounts the, yeah, now it's at v1 API docs because it's actually using that initializer. But it still thinks that they're in that same place. So the doc path, there we go. So, okay, so now got that part right. Now it expects the README, the API.mbd to be there too. So let's fix that. There we are. So we have our first documented endpoint. So here we go. Users, post v1 users. See what the parameters are, the description of them, an example, what the headers are, what the body of that looks like, what the response is, and the body of the response. And then as we add the rest, we'll add the other endpoints, we'll add the get and updates, etc. We'll build out the documentation. It'll look like this. We get it for free for testing our API. All right, so we did the first one. We did the first action. From here, it's going to be a little, kind of repetitive and pretty straightforward, but I'm going to stop here and then pick that back up later. So let me switch back over. So we kind of muddled through setting it up. I hope that gave you confidence that it's really not that bad, even if you just were starting from scratch and looking through the docs of the various projects. We TDD'd, just created a test, fixed the 50 errors that we saw, and eventually it works. So anyways, next time we will keep it going. See ya.